Good afternoon and good morning, and welcome to today's webinar, Bridging the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the key to an effective implementation. My name is Valentina Bolognesi. I'm a Senior Advocacy and Engagement Advisor at amfori, and it is really my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, which is jointly organized alongside the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles and with the support of the German Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights. If we could move to the next slide, please. As a reminder, today's webinar actually comes as part of a series of webinars on due diligence laws in practice. Actually, it is number 13th of the series. We have been over the years unpacking aspects of emerging due diligence laws, and we've always tried to explain also what those laws mean in practice for businesses and offer also some practical insights into how companies can get prepared for implementation. Spoiler alert, we're going to be continuing to do those webinar series in the future, therefore do keep an eye out for the work that we do. If we could now move to the next one, just a reminder of the housekeeping rules. You are muted. Nevertheless, we do encourage you to engage with us through the Q&A function of Zoom, to post your questions there throughout the whole duration of the webinar. We are going to have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, where we're going to be trying to answer the questions live, but also try to answer some of those in writing. However, we realize that we're not always able to answer them all. Therefore, we do apologize already in advance. We're going to be recording this webinar, and the recording and the slides will be shared with you afterwards alongside a satisfaction survey, because your opinion matters to us. So please take the time to tell us what you thought of the webinar and how we can improve going forward. Now, maybe what is it that we would want you to take away with you as a result of this webinar? What's our ambition for today, and why we decided to cover this very topic today at this very point in time? We have been talking to members of amfori, to businesses more broadly, and we know that they have been heavily preparing for the implementation of the CSDDD and the CSRD. We also know that companies will continue to prepare, many of them, despite the uncertainty that are brought about by omnibus discussions in Brussels. So we see an opportunity actually here to try to outline the areas, the aspects where the CSDDD and the CSRD connect. So this is actually what we're going to try and unpack as part of the webinar today. Try to identify areas where there are synergies between the two directives. And the whole idea behind is that perhaps by identifying those synergies, those areas where the two directives connect, we can also offer ideas for efficiencies and hopefully ideas for simplification, which is a word that is gaining so much momentum in Brussels nowadays. So simplification potentially can also come through a better understanding of the interlinkage between the CSDDD and the CSRD. So we're going to try to aim for this through a mix of deep dives into the CSDDD and the CSRD. This will be in the hand of Michaela from the German Helpdesk, telling us what the risk analysis looks like under CSDDD and the impact materiality under CSRD, what they are meant to achieve, similarities but also differences. And then we're gonna have practical examples from Erika at amfori and Felicia at GIZ. They will talk about the due diligence and reporting journey through amfori Sustainapass, and also how the Green Button supports its members with implementation of due diligence, with a special focus on risk analysis. And then we're going to slowly move to a close with interventions from Philip at Frank Bold. He will talk about some emerging good practices and also share with us some recommendations. A point where I think it's always good to start when it comes to try and understand also the interlinkage between CSDDD and CSRD is probably going back to the foundation and to the roots, if we can call it this way, of the laws. And this is the notion of risk-based due diligence, which is a notion that is not new per se. It actually comes from international standards on responsible business conduct due diligence, such as the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD M&E guidelines. And in there, we have the concept of risk-based due diligence as a tool that can actually help companies to understand the kind of negative impacts that they might be connected to at the level of people and the environment through their activities, through their business relationships. Once that understanding is there, companies can actually, through due diligence, also establish the way they are connected to those negative impacts. They can also establish the severity of those negative impacts. And this is with a view to deciding where to put their resources on, where to focus, where to prioritize. And then due diligence is the tool that actually helps companies determine what kind of actions can I put in place now, and how can I best manage the adverse impacts that I'm connected to. When something goes wrong, due diligence expects companies, of course, to fix what went wrong. And because due diligence is never a perfect exercise, there is this idea that companies should monitor how actually the activities and the policies and the measures are being or not effective. Interestingly enough, due diligence also foresees in and of itself that companies should communicate on their due diligence. So there is already an expectation that companies are transparent about the actions that they put in place. Now, if we translate this notion of risk-based due diligence into the CSDDD and the CSRD, so if we can move to the next slide, we can hopefully start to see a little bit where the complementarity exists. The CSDDD translates the notion of risk-based due diligence into the legal text, and thereby stipulates that companies have to conduct due diligence to identify and manage negative impacts to people and the environment. CSRD, on the other hand, it does not require companies to do due diligence, but it requires and it expects companies to report on, amongst other things, the material impacts that they have identified through, amongst others, their due diligence. So that, I think, is a first point of connectivity or interlinkage between the two, that hopefully through the help of Michaela and then also Philip and the other speakers, we're going to be able to unpack in greater detail. Now, if we move to this slide, is also to better understand how CSDDD and CSRD work together. So if due diligence is about the doing, is about behaving in a certain way, as we know, CSRD is about reporting, is about telling a story externally as to the efforts and as to the progress that a company is making in managing, amongst other things, its negative impacts. So if we move from the green side progressively towards the purple side, if in the due diligence space, companies have to conduct due diligence and embed due diligence into policies and management systems, under CSRD in reporting terms, that would mean reporting on how the governance of the company is structured, the kind of policies that the company has put in place. If under due diligence, companies are expected to identify and prioritize negative impacts through the lens of severity and likelihood, in reporting terms, in CSRD terms, that would mean explaining how the material impacts have been identified. If under CSDDD, companies have to take steps to prevent, mitigate, and bring negative impacts to an end, under CSRD, that would mean in reporting terms, describing the kind of actions that have been taken. There is an expectation under CSDDD that companies engage with stakeholders along the way. In reporting terms, that would mean describing how the stakeholders have been engaged. Monitoring, as we talked about at the very beginning, monitoring is an expectation in the sense that due diligence is never meant to be perfect, but there needs to be a way to track if what companies are doing is making sense. Under reporting in CSRD, that would mean describing the targets that have been set to monitor progress, so on and so forth. So that's really in a high level manner where we can identify interlinkages and explaining how the two directives work together. But now I'm really looking forward to handing over to Michaela from the German Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights, because she's gonna really take a deep look at the risk analysis under CSDDD and impact materiality under CSRD and explain and tell us how they work and what they are meant to do. Over to you, Misha. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Valentina. And before I'll dive into the CSDDD and the CSRD, I'll quickly, on the next slide, please, share some words about the German Helpdesk so you all know who we are. We are a German government support service for businesses and business associations, and we offer initial consultation, referral advice, and also awareness raising in business and human rights. And on the next slide, you find an overview over our services. So I've already mentioned our free of charge advisory services. These are unfortunately only for German companies. We also offer training programs, and this really ranges from us sharing our materials with companies so that they can design their own programs, up to us designing programs together with companies and rolling them out in the company. We also have a free of charge e-learning program. You can see on the slide, our hyperlinks are in orange. So when the slides will be shared with you, I invite you to click on them and check out what's behind it, because there are some really great support services, including the e-learning program, which is more basic for people who haven't yet inform themselves in relation to due diligence processes. We also participate in events like today, but we also have our own event formats in different contexts, sometimes also involving other stakeholders like actors from the political sphere or civil society organizations. We have several free of charge online tools. They are also available in different languages and also available for companies around the world. Our SME Compass has two components. The due diligence compass, that really is a hands-on step-by-step guide on how to implement a due diligence system in your company. The second component, the standards compass, helps companies identify how standards can support the due diligence process, but also help identify limitations of the use of standards and allow companies to compare certain standards. Our CSR risk checker is a great tool for the abstract risk analysis. You'll find a really easy search mask. Please check it out. It's really, really easy to use, that guides you to around about 3,000 data sets that are relevant in this context. And then lastly, our Business and Human Rights Navigator highlights 11 topics from the context of business and human rights, explains how to address them in the individual stages of the due diligence process, is a great glossary also to access other guidances from other organizations, and also has lots of practical examples of how companies dealt with these topics in practice. On the next slide, please, before I actually start with everything CSRD, CSDDD related, I have to bring a disclaimer. You all know, Valentina has mentioned as well, the omnibus process has started. The clock was stopped just today, and there will be revisions probably also on the CSRD and the CSDDD. So a lot of the things that I'm saying now might still hold up in a couple of years' time, but there might also be some changes that we cannot really foresee yet. Starting with CSRD and CSDDD on the next slide, please. Before diving into the materiality assessment, I wanted to make a quick comparison of the CSRD and the CSDDD, as well as the German Supply Chain Act. That's actually quite similar to the CSDDD. So we're all on the same page. So because all of these legislative acts relate to sustainability in one way or another, but actually the objectives and the functioning of these rules are quite different. And the CSRD relates to reporting in relation to sustainability information. And the goal is to create transparency in relation to sustainability performance for a wider group of stakeholders, also including investors. And it does that by obliging companies to report on sustainability aspects using the ESRS through the process of double materiality and to then identify and report on material sustainability-related impacts, risks, and opportunities, the IROs, in the whole value chain. And sustainability-related impacts, risks, and opportunities means both impact materiality, so what we call in the context of the CSDDD, positive and negative impacts on human rights and the environment, as well as risks and opportunities. And these risks and opportunities are the financial materiality, and this concerns risks for the activities of the companies stemming from sustainability aspects, but also opportunities that result from sustainability aspects. But we'll go into this a little bit deeper in a bit. And the German Supply Chain Act, as well as the CSDDD, yeah, they are not only about reporting, they're actually about implementing due diligence processes. So obliged companies have to actually implement a due diligence process in their supply chain or chain of activities in the language of the CSDDD. And the how is that they have to identify, prevent, stop and minimize, prioritize negative impacts in the language of the German Supply Chain Act is risks and violations. And to go a little bit more into detail on the differences and similarities between CSRD, CSDDD, and Supply Chain Act, on the next slide, please. You can see that there's like lots of similarities, but there's some differences in the details. So the protected legal positions is actually quite similar. So it both relates in relation to human rights and the environment. But as I mentioned already, the CSRD also includes the financial materiality, so also risks and opportunities for the company's activities in relation to sustainability aspects, stemming from sustainability aspects. And it also additionally includes governance topics that are not covered by the CSDDD or the German Supply Chain Act. The CSRD also relates to positive impacts on human rights and the environment, while the German Supply Chain Act and CSDDD only relate to negative impacts. Prioritization is very similar, actually. The CSRD requires that prioritization happens according to severity and likelihood. Similar, exactly the same, actually, the CSDDD requires prioritization according to severity and likelihood of occurrence. The German Supply Chain Act refers to appropriateness criteria. There also you can find the severity and likelihood of occurrence. And it's mostly understood that these are the criteria relevant for prioritization. The coverage of the value chain is a bit different. The CSRD covers the whole value chain, so from sourcing the raw materials through production, shipping, sale, usage, up to disposal of the product, so the whole life cycle, whereas both the Supply Chain Act and the CSDDD are looking more at the upstream part. Downstream in the CSDDD is only included in a very limited way. And the nature of the obligations is also different. So on the one hand, we have the reporting obligations of the CSRD, and then the due diligence obligations of the Supply Chain Act and the CSDDD. In relation to climate change, the German Supply Chain Act doesn't say anything. CSDDD, as of now, requires companies to implement and actually put into practice a climate plan. This obligation is considered to be met when companies are reporting a climate plan according to the CSRD, and the CSRD only includes a reporting obligation in this regard. And stakeholder engagement is relevant in all three legislative acts. It's actually central to all three of them, even though in practice we see that companies find this quite challenging. And stakeholder engagement in the context of the Supply Chain Act and the CSDDD is actually important through the whole process of your due diligence process, through all the steps. And the CSDDD even explicitly requires companies to protect stakeholders from negative consequences and address access barriers to participating in a consultation and stakeholder engagement. And in the context of the CSRD, stakeholder engagement is relevant for the materiality assessment. Okay, and moving on to the next slide, I'll now quickly describe the risk analysis under the CSDDD, and before I describe the materiality assessment. The risk analysis under the CSDDD, so this is a procedure to identify and prioritize potential and actual negative impacts, and Companies must use quantitative and qualitative information to do that. They must use appropriate resources, including independent reports and information gathered through the notification mechanism and complaints procedure. And oftentimes the risk analysis is divided into individual steps, and under the CSDDD, companies shall start with a mapping of their chain of activities, so their own operations of business partners, to identify areas where impacts are most likely and most severe, and then based on this mapping do an in-depth assessment. In this context, they shall prioritize requesting information from business partners where an impact is assumed, in order to alleviate burdens from direct business partners that are often the channel through which companies go in order to get more information in relation to the supply chain. And in case information cannot be obtained for the purpose of the risk analysis, this is not a disadvantage. Companies shall not face any disadvantages under the CSDDD. And then in the next step after the analysis, companies need to prioritize. On the next slide, please. I've already mentioned that prioritization happens according to severity and likelihood of occurrence. And severity in this context means scale, scope, and reversibility. This is identical to actually the UNGP. So scale means how severe, scope, how many or how big is the area affected, and reversibility, obviously, like is the impact reversible? But not only yes or no, but also like how difficult is it? How many resources need to flow into this? Do works need to maybe take place that might be difficult to be accepted by the communities affected? And other criteria, the CSDDD clarifies this, maybe also in reaction to the experiences from Germany. Criteria like influence or contributions are not a suitable criteria for prioritization of negative impacts. And on this chart, you see, obviously, this is an example. You cannot always say that chemical usage in plastic production in Vietnam has a high severity and a medium likelihood of occurrence. You would actually have to look at the specific circumstances of the case. It really depends, what are the environmental impacts? Is a bigger area severely polluted with that requires really extensive works, or is it just less pollution that can be fixed more easily? And also the likelihood of occurrence really depends on what's the situation on the ground. So you cannot always say this product, this country, this problem is this severe and this likely of happening. Moving on to the principle of double materiality, so the materiality analysis. And now I'm mentioning it for the third time, so we're in the context of the CSRD. It's quite similar to the risk analysis, I find, but we're including more things. So we're not only looking at the impact materiality, that is quite similar to the risk analysis of the CSDDD, but we're also looking at the financial materiality. And in the context of the impact materiality, we're not only looking at negative impacts, we're also looking at positive impacts. And I've put some examples on the slide for you, so it's a little bit more understandable, but less abstract. So what could be a positive impact in the context of the impact materiality? So positive impacts of companies' activities on human rights and the environment. And in this example is contributing positively to the conservation of water by utilizing surface water and rainwater. And a negative impact could be, for example, human rights risks such as child labor or forced labor in the supply chain because certain materials were used. And then financial materiality. So again, these are the risks and opportunities resulting from sustainability aspects on the company's activities. So a risk would be that something might be, jeopardizing the company's activity. And in this example, it must be related to sustainability aspects. And our example here is that a production facility might not be usable because of extreme weather conditions like heavy rain or flooding. So I think that's quite obviously a risk from sustainability. An opportunity from sustainability might be that companies' access to capital is improved because they have implemented a due diligence process. Another example could also be that a company discovers a new field of activities because new services are designed that are required for sustainability reasons, for example. And yes, how is materiality determined? So when is something a material? And the basis of this is the assessment that we've just seen of impacts, risks, and opportunities. And as soon as one impact, risk, or opportunity exceeds the materiality threshold, the whole subtopic is considered material, and companies must be reporting on that. And yeah, the tricky thing here is that there's no specific materiality threshold in the CSRD or in the ESRS. Instead, companies need to determine the materiality threshold themselves individually. But this doesn't mean that they can just, say, okay, yeah, maybe not, and go by their gut feeling. Instead, they should document well why they consider this to be the materiality threshold, and they're not allowed to just determine the materiality threshold themselves, but they need to do this in consultation together with stakeholders. And not only the materiality threshold needs to be determined this way, but also a list of material topics. And when we're looking at how companies can then determine, they've determined the threshold, now they're looking at, okay, is the use of water in my own facility, do we actually reach this threshold? So when actually applying the thresholds on the different on the different actors and places in the value chain, sometimes it's really difficult to get the data necessary to do that. And what we're observing, especially in the context of the German Supply Chain Act with the risk analysis, is a little bit different, but quite similar. And I'm hearing this a lot from people who are advising on the CSRD. It's a bit of the same situation. As companies very heavily rely on speaking with their on information from their suppliers, in particular from their direct suppliers, and asking them, what's the situation? And in many contexts, this is information that the supplier themselves might not have, maybe because it relates to the deeper supply chain, but maybe also because it's information in relation to their own facility that they do not have. For example, when it comes to specific environmental topics, they might not know how much they are emitting in relation to CO2 emissions, for example. And in this context, it's possible to use estimates, to use sector average data, for example, or to use approximations. And I think this is really important because it doesn't make any sense to try to measure the world on a really granular level, and in particular in contexts in which the situation is more or less known, or where companies could also alleviate burdens on their suppliers by working together and by creating data sets in relation to the sector, for example, for companies to use as average. I think this companies should really make use of this. And I believe that this is also a chance for companies to reduce bureaucratic burdens on themselves, but also on their suppliers. Yes. Looking at what are the topics companies need to look at in the materiality assessments. Here's a quick overview over the ESRS. So there's the general requirements, the general disclosures, and then you find these three topics, basically: environment, social, and governance. And we will take a little bit of a closer look into the social standards, but looking at this already, I haven't brought the slides in relation to the protected legal positions from the CSDDD or from the German Supply Chain Act, but there's a lot of overlap. So also the CSDDD and the Supply Chain Act look at own operations, so human rights in own operations, so like own workforce. And then they also look at workers in the value chain and affected communities. What's not where we don't have this overlap is consumers and end users. And we also have lots of overlap in the environmental sector, even if it's labeled a little bit different in the CSDDD. But if you look at the international conventions in relation to the protection of the environment that the CSDDD takes recourse to, you will find that there's lots of overlap to the environmental standard of the ESRS. moving on to the next slide to take maybe a little bit of a deeper dive into the S standard, because this is one, I would like to use as an example to look at the overlap or the positions that are protected here. So in relation to own workforce and workers of the supply chain, they are the same protected legal positions, working conditions that are also covered under the Supply Chain Act and the CSDDD, equal treatment and equal opportunities, and then other labor-related rights. We also have affected communities, so economic, social, and cultural rights of communities, civil and political rights of communities, and the rights of indigenous people. And then S4, obviously, we don't have this overlap because we're not looking at consumers and end users and the downstream part in this context in the German Supply Chain Act and the CSDDD. But what we're seeing is when looking at that, this is really closely modeled on the international standards on which also the CSDDD and the German Supply Chain Act are based. Maybe moving on to the next slide to also look at the sustainability aspects in S1 and S2 a little more closely. So what is meant when we're talking about working conditions? So secure employment, working time, fair remuneration, social dialogue, but also freedom of associations, right to collective bargaining, work-life balance, and operational safety and health. And then equal treatment and opportunities of all is obviously gender equality and equal pay for equal work, but also rights in relation to training and skills development, employment and inclusion of people with disabilities, measures against violence and harassment in the workplace, and diversity. And the other work-related rights is child labor, forced labor, appropriate housing, and then water and sanitary facilities and data protection. So when we're looking at similarities and differences of the due diligence, mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation and the CSRD, I think it is quite clear that companies should try to comply with these requirements in an integrated approach. And this is necessary because this creates consistent results between materiality assessment and risk analysis. What we're observing very often, or what we're hearing a lot from companies when we're advising them, is that they're telling us that the CSR, the materiality assessment and the risk analysis for the Supply Chain Act are done in different departments in the company, and they will use different resources, they will come to different conclusions, and then you have conflicting reports. And when looking at the type of assessment and also the topics that are being analyzed, it is my understanding that discrepancies between the reports should be, please one slide back again, should be almost impossible. And by having more consistent results, this increases credibility both internally and externally. And companies this way also avoid duplicating work and additional costs. So in my opinion, it doesn't make any sense to having the exact same or very similar processes being done over and over and over again, when they could also be more streamlined. And when doing this with an integrated approach, this also creates a sound basis for the development of a sustainability strategy, because you don't have these conflicting results in the different reports. And on my last slide, on the next slide, I would like to show what we're suggesting as a process on how to integrate this into one another. And because the risk analysis under the CSDDD or the Supply Chain Act is just a small part of the materiality assessment, because with the materiality assessment, you're also looking at the positive impacts on human rights and the environment as part of the impact materiality, but you're also looking at the financial materiality, so risks and opportunities, because this is just a small part of it. It makes sense to start with that. So start with the risk analysis and then include your results from the risk analysis into your materiality assessment and start from there. So we're suggesting a three-step process: identify your impacts, risk, and opportunities. So by including potential actual risks and violations from the risk analysis, when you're doing this with the German Supply Chain Act, there might be potentially new topics based on the CSDDD. Then evaluate the impacts based on severity and likelihood. So this is what's required both for the CSDDD and the CSRD and the materiality assessment. And include these risks based on likelihood and severity. And then as a next step, also include the risks and opportunities. This is a later step because they're not relevant in the due diligence process. But what's important to note in this context as well is that a risk, a financial risk might also stem from an impact in the sense of the impact materiality. For example, when like the example on the slide, let's use this one, when forced labor in the supply chain also creates reputational risks, because, for example, consumers are less willing to buy the product because it is understood as being connected to forced labor, for example. This might create financial disadvantages and therefore also be relevant in the context of the financial materiality. So this much about the similarities and differences of the risk analysis and the materiality assessment, and I hand over back to you, Valentina.
Thank you so much, Misha. Also perfectly on time. So I'm really grateful for that. I also see that there are quite some questions coming through. So just a reminder, do not hesitate to use the Q&A functionality of Zoom to post your questions. So thank you, Misha, for walking us through the differences and similarities, for utilizing some examples, and also for suggesting how the two processes could be integrated. And now I'm very happy to welcome Erica Sock, Senior Sustainability Expert at amfori. So she will walk us through the due diligence and reporting journey of an amfori member via amfori Sustainapass. Over to you, Erica.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Valentina. So first, I will give a very quick introduction on amfori. amfori is a business association advocating for sustainable trade and supporting companies across the globe to operate successful and responsible businesses by improving environmental, social, and governance performances in their supply chain. So amfori offers different solutions to its member and suppliers to support the identification, analysis, and mitigation/remediation of risk, such as you can see amfori BSCI, amfori BPI, Speak for Change, which are respectively looking at human rights and environmental risk, as well as grievance mechanism. Here, I will be presenting amfori Sustainapass, which is amfori solution to bridge due diligence and reporting journey. amfori Sustainapass guides companies through due diligence step by step. So using a modular approach, each of the modules is subdivided into several actions to allow a progressive and logical approach of the due diligence journey. It also connects ESG data from amfori BSCI and amfori BPI, as well as the ESG risk compass, to better inform the decision of the company in terms of risk and impact, to assess it, and then to manage those risks and impact. And finally, amfori Sustainapass automatically creates some sections of your sustainability report through a structured template inspired by CSRD. It is not a compliance tool as such, but it contributes to develop your sustainability reporting following industry-leading framework, having a risk-based approach, and integrating stakeholder engagement throughout your entire due diligence process, which have been also previously mentioned. amfori Sustainapass guides you through interconnected modules. So the three modules you can see on the right, the materiality module aim at identifying material topic. Then you have the risk and impact management module that allows you to further assess your ESG risks, what we called before the financial materiality, and your impact, which was called previously impact materiality in your value chain. And then you have the final reporting module, which collects and structure the outcome of your due diligence exercise. So let's have a look at the materiality assessment. The materiality module has 3 sections which aim at capturing inputs from 3 different streams. Through a final summary step, the company can then visualize the outcome of the exercise and define what is material and what is not. The first step, so my company collects and documents internal stakeholder sustainability priorities. The second step on supply chain, look at your supply chain related risk and impact. And then the third step, the stakeholder step, document your external stakeholder engagement effort and exercise. The fourth step, which is the materiality matrix, allows you to select which topic is material to you and which one are not. So that's what I've mentioned earlier. We're going to have a quick look at the screenshot so you can have a glimpse of the Sustainapass. So as I said, to give you a quick glimpse at the platform and how it helps company in their due diligence exercise, the materiality modules guide you through different steps to collect relevant feedback from the 3 streams I've previously mentioned. One key step is the mapping of your internal stakeholder, meaning your company, department, and governance. So that's the first screenshot. And then the second one, you can see how it collects information and how you can define the level of importance of each of those departments that have been documented and the topics that have been defined as material. The second step, connect the data of your supply chain with associated country risk level to again help you identify which topics are important from your supply chain perspective this time. So first step being your internal stakeholders, so your own company material topic, well, important topic. Second being the supply chain view. And the third one, as I said, the third step, document your stakeholder engagement activities. So it collects important topics from your external stakeholder engagement exercise. The final steps summarize the exercise done in the 3 pillars I've mentioned before and allow you to select what is material to what is not material. So what is important here is that at the end of this exercise, well, it's not the end of your full due diligence exercise, but at the end of this exercise, then the information you have populated in this module then goes into the next module, which is your risk and impact management. In double materiality, both risk to the company, so the financial materiality and the impact on people and planet, so the impact materiality are considered equally important with the goal of providing a holistic view of the company's performances and responsibilities. Some topics might be high on your risk scale and high as well on impact scale, and they will constitute probably the most material topics for your company. How can Sustainapass help in this analysis? So the module supports company in the risk and impact assessment, meaning analyzing and evaluating the severity of those important topics. And then the module help documenting action to prevent, mitigate, or remediate the negative risk or impact. Amfori Sustainapass collect data on the company supply chain from different sources. So internal data, meaning the data from Amfori BSCI and BPI, as well as external data from external reliable public sources. And the data is translated into a heat map to support company in their prioritization exercise, basically to answer to the question, where should I start? Once you know where to start, production side social and environmental performances data are displayed in a central kind of repository to allow company evaluating the risk level. The material impact is assessed through the impact assessment framework that has also been mentioned previously, so severity and likelihood. Therefore, each topic is assessed against this framework on the impact materiality. And once the material topic is prioritized and assessed, which is the exercise done previously, the company can develop the action plan and document it for their own activity and work on the reporting of those remediation plan. We have a very quick look at the reporting. The first part of the reporting module centralizes the outcome of the company due diligence exercise. So pretty much everything that have been done in the materiality module and the risk and impact module are then reported in the reporting module, which can be downloaded as an Excel. And on top of this centralized view of your exercise. There's also a second part of the reporting module that is composed of a series of questions inspired by CSRD that helps you structure your reporting and develop your sustainability narrative. So this is an example of questions that are asked in business ethics, but there's much more. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Erica, for again being extremely diligent with time and for offering indeed an overview of some of the things that can be done through amfori Sustainapass, and perhaps something that we might want to add, that this product was designed keeping in mind the SMEs, but in reality it can be utilized by amfori members across the board. So that's our way to support companies with bridging the gap between due diligence and reporting. And now I am very happy to welcome Felicia, and I will not try to pronounce her, maybe technical advisor at GIZ. Apologies for that. So Felicia, you are going to walk us through the green button, what it does, and how it supports its members with the implementation of due diligence, with a special focus on risk analysis. Over to you.
Exactly. Thank you, Valentina, and thank you everybody for having me and for tuning in today. So a green button is a certification scheme and can be used as a tool for due diligence implementation. So because green button is a relatively young standard, let me take a few slides to introduce it. In short, it's a government-owned certification label for brands and retailers centered around human rights and environmental due diligence. The scheme owner is the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, in short, BMZ. It's a sister project to the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles in that way. In the last 5 years, Green Button has been successful in establishing itself and the idea that HIEDD is possible to being assessed. It is currently the third most recognized sustainable clothing label in Germany, and over 425 million items of clothing have been sold labeled with the green button. Green button is also very aligned with the German law. We actually have a comparison and will adapt to cover CSDDD once there's clarity on what CSDDD will look like. However, none of the laws that we're talking today include a safe harbor, so responsibility for adherence with the law remains with the company, even if they use a certification such as Green Button or other certificates, or the tools that are used within them. With that being said, let me give you an overview of what Green Button does. It assesses brands' human rights and environmental due diligence systems. In addition, it requires labeled products to come from certified supply chains. But for the purpose of today's meeting, we will focus on the HIEDD pillar because that's what's relevant to today's session. So what do we mean by that? Human rights and environmental due diligence, as defined by the UN Guiding Principles and OECD guidances, are at the heart of Green Button standards. We have divided the due diligence process into 5 core steps, as depicted on the previous slide. Sorry for that. Thank you. So what it does is it encourages companies to develop an HIEDD management system and engage in continuous improvement of that system. And now we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the task today is to talk you through how Green Button supports companies in HIEDD, and it does so in a variety of ways. We offer a variety of services, tools, and support to companies when they are preparing for the audit, as well as during the period that they are licensed, which usually is 3 years. Where we offer webinars preparing companies for requirements of continuous improvement and other engagement opportunities. All of the services and tools are free to use for companies registered in the Green Button portal, which is also free. You can find there, for example, a guide on what the Green Button requires companies to do with examples, practical ideas, as well as possibilities on how you can implement it, as well as a self-assessment where you can look at yourself and your own practices against the standard and see how you're doing before you enter for the audit. On the next slide, you can see a screenshot of the guide. We have just recently, just last week, released the English version, so apologies here. We have still the screenshot of the German one. And on the next slide, we can go into what we're here to talk about today, the risk assessment. So Green Button offers a risk analysis tool. Again, it's free to use and it's available in the portal. It's in English or German. And when you look at on the next slide, you can see what it looks like. Here's a very short snapshot of the Excel tool. Why is it Excel? Because particularly smaller Green Button companies appreciate that it's not a complicated IT tool or a new software solution that you have to install and make work with all your existing stuff. It's Excel. Everybody knows how to handle it. It's very easy. You can integrate it into your own processes. It usually is compatible with whatever you have currently going on. So this is handy, but as I mentioned before, using the tool does not guarantee you a safe harbor. The law foresees that responsibility remains with the company, even if you use this tool. So what does it do on the next slide? It guides you through the risk analysis process in a handy way, and it documents this process. So you follow a 3-step process, and you have the prioritization similar to what the colleagues have explained for severity and likelihood. You can input your countries where your production takes place and look at country-specific risks. You then input materials and material-related risks, and then you look also at your own behavior as a brand and how that might contribute to the occurrence of risks in the supply chain. So you look at your own purchasing behavior. You combine all of these three, and then it results in this prioritization that I mentioned. So it is similar to the materiality assessment that Michaela mentioned. I would say it's useful for what Micha called the first step that you should be doing. And on the next slide, you can see our companies agree. Green Button is helpful for human rights and environmental due diligence. Here's some excerpts of what they have to say, that it really has been helpful, specifically also in regards to the German law. I saw that there was a question about it. So you can look into Green Button if you're interested to learn more about that. Our contact details are on the next slide. Really happy if you reach out to us through the portal or the information email on the slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Felicia. Sorry, I was struggling with the camera and the audio. Thanks for walking us through what the support for the due diligence looks like through the Green Button. And now I am extremely pleased to welcome Philip Gregor, Head of Responsible Companies at Frank Bold, with us. So we have asked you, Philip, to tell us a little bit what it is that you are observing. You work with companies, you have been advising companies, you have analyzed and assessed also some of the early reports coming out of companies reporting under CSRD. So there is probably some good practice that is emerging. There are some good recommendations that you would want to share with the audience today. And the audience is really a mix of businesses, but also stakeholders more broadly. So we are all very much looking forward to hearing from you, and we will be controlling the slides. So let us know when you want us to move to the next ones, and welcome.
Thank you, Valentin. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me well, please?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So just by way of introduction, my name is Philip Gregor. As Valentina mentioned, I'm with Frank Bold. And Frank Bold is a quite, I would say, a strange beast. We do quite a lot of things. But one thing that's important to know that I'm a member of the EFRAG Sustainability Reporting Board, EFRAG being the body which is advising the European Commission on sustainability reporting standards and so on. I'll speak about it a little bit more. One other point that I wanted to make before we start is that it's a little bit too early to speak about the let's say the first experiences with the CSRD. Now I will have a couple of bits for you, but the research into this area is still ongoing because only a minority of companies have already published the first regulated report. So I'll show you something, but it's very much a work in progress. So with that, we can jump right into it. So please, for the first slide. Okay, so I wanted to start by asking this question: what on earth is going on? And I understand that you've been engaged in discussions on the omnibus and so on and so forth. And I just wanted to add a little bit of perspective. Otherwise, the rest of what I would be saying wouldn't make much sense. So let's get into it. There's a little bit on Frank Bolt. You will see the links at the end. This is a kind of a snapshot of what we do, from kind of EU-wide research into practices and especially reporting, through legal analysis. We are just publishing an overview of the EU corporate sustainability legislation, how it interacts together, how issues like due diligence are addressed through different legislations, what are the interactions, and so on and so forth. So please watch out for that. And there's quite an interesting podcast we're hosting. You can see some of the speakers below, so please check it on our website. But so you understand the breadth of the activities that we're doing here. I should also say that we work directly with companies on implementation, so we've got some insights into that. So let's move on. Now, what's happening right now is pretty much this. The EU Green Deal of 2019 is hitting a new reality, and it's ugly. It's ugly in a sense that Europe is politically very insecure right now, and it's ugly in a sense that its reaction has been kind of instinctively to cut sustainability legislation. But I don't want to speak about it too much. I just want to highlight on the next slide, please, what the omnibus does not change. And now I'm assuming that you have a sense of the omnibus and so on and so forth. So I won't go into details, but one thing that is not proposed in the omnibus are the changes to the fundamental concepts in the corporate sustainability reporting directive, and there's the double maturity assessment that you have spoken about, the key climate reporting requirements, and the majority of quantitative metrics or KPIs in the so-called ESRS, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. So these are really essential elements that are going to stay, or are supposed to stay, even for the companies for whom the obligation is now being kind of agreed to be postponed by 2 years. For corporate sustainability due diligence directive, again, I mean, the proposal is not to tinker with the very fact and existence of the core sustainability due diligence obligation, even though there's a heated debate on the, whether it should be limited to particular tiers. Similarly, the climate transition plans, which are in the CSDDD, are not being challenged entirely, at least, so they are supposed to be still, something that companies should focus on. And the very kind of act of reporting on due diligence through ESRS also stays. So I think this is important to realize what is actually not being changed, what is actually not being put into question, at least for the time being. Okay, so with this introduction, I can start doing, Valentina, what you asked me for, and we can start by the interaction between due diligence and the European standards. And I understand from just from what I have heard that you have discussed that a little bit, but let me just draw the connections. So most of you would be familiar with the famed OECD kind of a depiction of the individual due diligence steps and how they should be implemented in corporate processes. That's on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, what you see are essentially reporting areas in the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And they correspond one-to-one with the due diligence steps. Now, the embed responsible business conduct in policies management systems, well, that's being captured through disclosure requirements under the reporting area governance. I can see the format is a little bit off, so apologies about it. The identification and assessment of severe adverse impacts under the due diligence, well, that's covered by double maturity assessment. Of course, we can have a discussion on what is the appropriate level of granularity and so on and so forth, but conceptually, it's the same. The taking action bit, which is number 3 in the OECD, that's policies and actions, tracking implementation, that's targets and metrics, and so on and so forth. I don't want to bother you too much with a theory, but that's essentially how it interacts. So, and that's why due diligence according to the CSDDD, the due diligence directive, should be reported in the through the CSRD and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. The areas which are highlighted in that weird yellow color, those are the areas on which we focus in our assessment of sustainability reports. And we will have some insights in the next couple of slides. So if you can go, please. So now finally on what's emerging as a practice in the market. But please, again, it's a work in progress. There are far too few reports out there so far. And I'll speak a little bit about the double materiality and so on, and due diligence risk management, but also about some kind of fundamental aspects of reporting and structure and so on, which may be interesting for those of you who actually have to prepare these reports. So the first thing, this is the result of our research last year. So from the pre-CSRD. So this is not yet that emerging practice on implementation on compliance. Now, half of our sample, all those figures are in persons. Half of about half of the companies we looked at, or 43%, made the claims about due diligence being kind of the basis of their reporting, but very, very few and provided the information about how this is really embedded in governance and in some of the key processes and so on. So that's kind of one big gap in practice. When it comes to the disclosure of the impacts, which is subject to double materiality assessment, as well as kind of the results of the ongoing human rights risk assessment, only 15% kind of gave you some specific information. The rest of the companies, 85%, spoke still about kind of general areas, and that's a really big gap in practice. And on stakeholder engagement and remedy and so on and so forth, it's just that's where the situation, I would say, is the wildest. So I won't comment on the numbers, so we don't have that much time. This is just for an illustration that when it comes to the fundamental aspects of due diligence, then when you translate them into reporting practice, before the CSRD kicked in, I mean, the situation wasn't really good, and there's not much of a good practice to speak of or emerging practice. So let's move on, please. I've got another such slide on climate transition plans. Now, we're speaking here about large listed companies, so it's a specific sample to be precise. So on the left-hand side, you can see a diagram which shows you that, again, about a half of the company presented a climate transition plan, and another half did not. Now, this is going to be an obligation under the CSDDD, unless politicians destroy it completely, which is not out of question right now. But at the same time, it's not going to be an obligation for all companies. So there's no fundamental issue with only half companies reporting this. What's more interesting is on the right-hand side, the quality of the information provided on the CTPs. Now, the numbers on the right are provided in absolute numbers. We had a sample of 100 companies. These are not percentages, okay? So I will comment only on the second item, assessment of locked-in emissions. This is really important because locked-in emissions basically tell you whether and what is the problem in your climate transition, where basically your production, products, assets, and so on are linked to the emissions that are going to continue, for the decades to come, either because of the longevity of the product or lifetime of the assets, or simply because you are just dependent on a particular business model or strategy. And this is really an area for improvement. So much on the starting position. Now, lots of this is going to change with companies now reporting against the standards, but also a lot of this will not change, especially among, let's say, less mature companies. On the next slide, we've got some of these emerging patterns from the first wave. Now, we'll have some examples of how reporting looks like, but right now, just those really big highlights. There is a massive difference in the length of the report. I think this was documented by PwC survey. And that length is not justified by the differences between the business models of companies. So there are good practices in terms of of conciseness, and really bad practices in including a lot of blah information. and that is a real issue. Again, I don't have concrete examples. I can point a finger on a concrete report yet, because we're still in the season. These differences are said to be, or are, I mean, this is all basically what people think about it. There's no, let's say, serious research about it, but they are being linked to the reporting culture in different jurisdictions. So, for example, French companies tend to produce really long documents because that's the culture in France, whereas the Nordic companies tend to be much shorter and arguably more readable and maybe more relevant in terms of the information included. Often, the length does not correlate with useful detail. Often, it's actually quite the opposite, that shorter reports tend to provide more meaningful information than longer. So, for the purpose of compliance with legislation, I think that's it's good to look to the Nordics, if I may say so. We are going to produce a compendium of best practice examples by the end of this month. We still are waiting for basically for companies to issue the reports, but we are already starting this work, but it will still take a couple of weeks. Now, when it comes to the content, the most interesting thing, and this comes from the PwC research I mentioned, but also from the Boston Consulting Group project for EFRAG, and the results of it will be available later, is that there is a great divergence of the numbers of the so-called IROs. IROs stand for impacts, risks, and opportunities. So as you can say, it's about 10 to 75, and I think the PwC research gives you even a greater spread. So that is an issue. But again, if company reports 75 impacts, risks, and opportunities, that does not mean that actually that information is, meaningful. Often these are basically generic, topics or subtopics and so on. And in this regard, it's not important to have a large number of impacts, risks, and opportunities. What really matters is that it is explained how the particular sustainability area really relates to your business activities and business relationships. I'll show you an example in a second. Then when it comes to the structure, a lot of companies are struggling by trying to keep kind of to slavishly follow the list of disclosure requirements in each standard. And it seems to be missed in the market that the European standards provide considerable degree of flexibility in terms of how information is presented. The only rule which is out there is that the strategic information should be in the cross-cutting section, and that environmental information, social, and governance information should be basically in these three sections. But it doesn't, companies do not need to, provide first the narrative disclosures on policies and so on and so forth, and then the metrics and go to the next topic. They can actually do it quite in an opposite way if they want to. They can provide all the metrics for environment in a single place, and then basically comment on it in terms of what kind of policies, actions they have. Also, what's being reported is that a lot of companies are focusing on static disclosure. We have such and such policy and such policy and such code of conduct. In this regard, the standards really require an indication that a thing like that exists and who's responsible for it. And the focus should really be, what do you do about those things? And I think this is very, very much aligned with the due diligence concept, but it doesn't always come clear across in the standards, and we can see it now in the practice as a problem. And finally, those kind of examples, if I may, just 2 slides. Let's move to the next one, please. So this is still from the last, no, the one with Ørsted. Yeah, exactly. So this is Ørsted's report from the last year. This year it looks quite similar but improved. But I just wanted to illustrate how high level description of the impacts can look like to basically give you an idea of what's going on, right? So you can judge it for yourself. Now, obviously, when you describe the details, what you do about it, you're supposed to go into much more details, and this is where the due diligence processes can really help you. But this is what the right level could be. And then companies are also asked to report on the process of the maturity assessment, which in its impact phase should be based on due diligence, ongoing due diligence, and that's on the next slide. Now, we can't do it on a slide, okay? And but this is one example from our last year research where a company actually did try to report on its impact maturity process with direct reference to some of the tools and methodologies and processes they are implementing as part of their due diligence and value chain mapping. So this is PUMA, and it's summarized. Okay, those bullet points, those are our summaries, and you would actually have to read like 2 or 3 pages of their text. But they basically tell you about all of this, and you get a good idea as a user that okay, that they are having a robust approach, and that actually what is it that they base their decisions and judgment on? Where do they actually have a really good information, where they are still building their approach, and so on and so forth. And it does not matter whether they are perfect in all areas. What matters is that they demonstrate that their process is robust. So PUMA report is an interesting example for kind of emerging the due diligence, their risk approach with reporting on the impact maturity process. And finally, the last slide, if I may. Couple of recommendations, and this is really tying back to this chaos created by Omnibus, like what to do and how to go about, all these standards and recommendations and postponed deadlines and so on and so forth. What actually stays? What we can trust, that makes sense in this situation. Well, first of all, the double maturity assessment really made good sense, and as it was mentioned before me, it could serve in a way for the companies that are only starting with all of this as kind of a first step that allows you to identify, okay, these are the areas where we should focus more in our, let's say, more detailed processes and so on and so forth. But the ultimate aim of this process is to get you data that matter for your business, not only for the users, but for your business. So if you approach this exercise with this in mind, it's actually very helpful. And as I said, very much aligned with the due diligence risk process under the CSDDD or due diligence. Now, for the value chain, there's a great confusion out there about the value chain, but really what the standards as well as international tools advise companies to do is to identify the areas of heightened risks of severe impacts and focus on those rather than blindly asking all suppliers about all kinds of things. And again, the standards do not require too much in that regard, just the focus really and kind of a continual improvements. It follows that it's important to understand your business relationships if you want to do this exercise. But companies are often, caught in a trap of trying to use the criteria from due diligence, the severity and the likelihood, scale, scope, remediable character for issues that do not need to be analyzed in this way, like GHG emissions and so on and so forth. Where there is I would call it, or Caroline Rees from Shift calls it, Google it rule. And it's actually embedded in the guidance for the maturity assessment by EFRAG, basically saying if there is a consensus or scientific consensus on a particular matter and its relevance to your sector, then you don't need to do this equilibristic. It's material, and you just go after the metrics, after the actions to manage it, and so on. You should reserve this kind of in-depth assessment for things that are not clear and for really those heightened risks of severe impact. So it's something that there's a lot of problems with in practice with this. Okay, I think I covered a couple of points now, 4, 5, 6. Then number 7 is local context always matters. You should know what are the common sectoral issues. There's the Google it rule, but then what do we know about local context in our operations, and but also in the value chain, to the extent we know about the value chain. Now, engagement with affected stakeholders should happen where it matters to the affected stakeholders and when it is helpful for the company to understand what's going on. It shouldn't be a kind of a general exercise of sending stakeholder surveys and so on. And the final aim of all of this is to basically be able not only to determine what is material, but be able to determine what are the good metrics, including qualitative metrics, to kind of measure the impacts and the effectiveness of our actions. And that's really the heart of the due diligence as well. Yep. And the last one, you can read it for yourself, but I think I made myself abundantly clear, like, what are the issues with this in practice. So that's it as far as my presentation go. I saw something about the VSME question in the chat. Happy to answer that if you find it appropriate, Valentina.
Thank you so much, Philip. I very much enjoyed listening to you. I think it was important to put things into context. So I think the very initial overview that you gave as to the status of the conversations in Brussels and globally, that was important. Thank you also for the recommendations, very practical, hands-on. We call it reporting with impact and amfori. I think it's important to not just report for the sake of it, but understand that you do it also for the purpose of wanting to drive impact. Now, we have questions, as you said, Philip, so I'm gonna hand over to Clara from GIZ and the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles. She will be the one moderating the Q&A. So over to you, Clara, to see how we go and address the questions. And if there are more questions to the audience, do not hesitate to continue posting them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Valentina, and happy to take over the moderation of the Q&A part. So first of all, thanks so much for submitting all of these questions. You might have realized that our speakers were already pretty busy answering them in writing, but we have the chance now to answer some of them live. And in regard to expectation management, we do have 15 minutes now, so I already apologize in advance. I don't think that we are able to address all of them, despite their relevance. So, Misha, I would like to start with you, as there have been several questions regarding your presentation. And 2 questions are quite similar. They are regarding the omnibus. I would read them out loud. So first one is, how do you interpret the omnibus proposal to focus on first tier only? Do you think it threatens the UNGP view to include the whole value chain perspective? And we could combine it with a second question, thoughts on where upstream tier N due diligence stands with the omnibus proposing to limit CSDDD, but no limitation to CSRD?
Yeah, happy to answer this, and obviously I don't know what's going to happen with the omnibus, but I have an opinion on what's being proposed, and also when discussing with German companies, what we've been hearing from them in relation to the proposal, and also in relation to the approach of the German Supply Chain Act in relation to the deeper supply chain versus the approach of the CSDDD as it is now, and I'm happy to share that. And I believe, and this is also what I'm hearing from companies, that limiting due diligence obligations on tier 1 and then having this difficult approach with substantiated knowledge of the German Supply Chain Act or these concerns from the proposed omnibus is actually not helping companies and will not reduce burdens for them. And this is also what companies are telling us. They're saying basically that with the approach of the German Supply Chain Act, they are constantly hunting these substantiated knowledges, these concerns, in order to see whether or not they have to do something in the deeper supply chain. And they prefer the approach of the CSDDD that allows them, in their opinion, to actually have more of a structured and systematic approach in relation to the deeper supply chain. I actually personally believe that you can still do this with the rules of the German Supply Chain Act, but the signal that this rule creates, and this is also a bit misleading, and it creates the impression that, oh, we focus on tier 1 and then only in the exception we have to look into the deeper supply chain. And this is actually really dangerous, because on the one hand, it overwhelms tier 1 suppliers, in particular when German companies do like 100% of the tier 1 suppliers, which is very common. And then also we all know that it is more likely to find more severe risks in the deeper supply chain. Not saying that tier 1 suppliers do not have risks either, but it is really problematic to then have this so misleading, this mismatch. And yes, similar to what's said in the question in relation to the CSRD, I have not heard that there are any plans to limit this to just tier 1 business partners.
Yeah, thanks so much, Misha, for that comprehensive answer. I would switch to Philippe, and I would ask you the following question. One participant is asking, isn't it a risk if you state Google it rule that we don't find new risk being proactive with UNGPs prescribe and only go for already known risks?
I hear you. Yeah, so it should be both. The point is to reserve the, I would say, UNGP approach to the areas of heightened risks. And I mean, this really fits, the human rights risk quite well. Like, you got the complex value chains, and you just need to basically unpack what is in there and just take a good decision, what to focus on and how to prioritize and so on and so forth. So you should absolutely do that. But it does not make sense to use this approach for the areas where the risks are clear, such as climate change, or for basically, or try to basically come up with some impacts for own workforce, whilst you have a workforce in Europe and where things are regulated and so on and so forth, and you're trying to figure out a way how to report, how to basically trigger reporting on the KPIs for own workforce, which are in the EU standards. You can only do that if you frame it around some kind of a material impact. But these are really basic KPIs, such as how much of your workforce is kind of covered by collective bargaining, right? So we would have to basically come up with an impact which says we got a negative impact in not having enough collective bargaining, or positive impact in having too much collective bargaining. So there's a lot of nonsense, silliness going on around around all of this, where actually you don't need to apply this kind of in-depth assessment, and you could just do it in a much more simple way. But that's a different thing from actually kind of going after these severe impacts and trying to investigate and doing in-depth assessment. And that very much links to what Michaela was saying, if I may comment on that, in a sense that yeah, both in the CSRD and CSDDD, you're supposed to focus. It's quite explicitly in the provisions. Yet what do we see in practice is that companies really do send those questionnaires to their low-risk suppliers, and the omnibus is trying to react to it by banning companies from asking ESG data or HRDD data companies, except of the data that would be in so-called voluntary SME standard, which is absolutely not fit for the purpose. And I think that's a really, really incorrect analysis. And I think it very much very closely matches with what Michaela was reported hearing from companies. And that is, it's exactly that limitation on tier 1 which triggers those questionnaires. Whereas if companies actually need to look at the entire value chain and really determine, okay, where the risk of severe impacts is the highest, and start with that, and legislation giving them that flexibility, that as long as they get the most important issues right, and there's a flexibility in terms of how they basically are able to address all of it, then this would lead to a much more targeted approach and limit the burden. And in addition to that, limiting what the smaller companies should be reporting by a kind of a set of quantitative KPIs, such as this is the amount of pollution, these are the GHG emissions, this is the number of workers, and that's it. And banning companies from asking them more is not going to help the due diligence. I mean, the companies will eventually have to again, ask these companies who would be excluded from the CSRD through the individualized questionnaires, because they could not read from their simplified voluntary reports like whether there's an indication of the likely impact. So the very outcome which is being sought by the Commission with the omnibus and these value chain caps and voluntary SME standards to limit these kind of senseless questionnaires and so on, is being defeated by the very proposal they made, which is driving companies to exactly do that, because because there is not kind of a standardized information from companies on their material impacts that would help basically to determine the focus and so on. So it's a chaos, and we have heard quite a bit of complaints from large companies about VSME cap, not only from this humanized due diligence perspective, but also from the perspective of really basic things such as, so I cannot now ask my suppliers for the data I need for calculation of my GHG emissions. Well, the answer obviously or clear is, well, no, you will be forbidden to ask this data, because the voluntary SME standard does not say that companies should provide you or should report to SMEs on things like materials, origin of materials, transportation. They only say that they are supposed to provide on scope 1, scope 2, and maybe scope 3 emissions, but you don't need their scope 3 emissions. You need the data on the material so you can calculate your emissions. So there are even these things that have been thought through and which are really kind of throwing the wrench in a running wheel. It's just
Yeah,
it
thanks
doesn't
so
hold
much.
together. Yeah,
Thanks
sorry
so
about
much,
that.
Philippe. No, this is a very comprehensive answer, and it's really helpful. Thank you. But I would like to ask you another question. And this question is on VSME. So one sustainability consultant for an Italian SME consulting firm, he is interested in asking you on how to using the VSE. So because they are out of the CSRD scope, so his question would be, what are the possible effects related to the omnibus? So will it be a delayed act about the VSME?
Yeah, so I would say rather on contrary, the Commission wants to adopt it as soon as possible because the omnibus refers to it directly. So they basically need to take a proposal from EFRAG, which was designed to standardize requests for kind of a non-high risk data, even from like micro undertakings, apply to companies that can be really huge, but just in terms of economic performance turnover, but just below 1,000 employees, and basically use that as some kind of a value chain cap, as I tried to explain before. And well, you know what I think about it now. But the thing is that Commission needs to adopt this act as soon as possible in order to be able to make that reference. Whether they would do it right away, because they have that proposal from EFRAG, even though, as I said, that that proposal was meant to do something very different, or whether they would wait a little bit to see how the legislative discussions in the Parliament will go on these matters, on the content of the omnibus, I do not know. But they have it, and they can adopt it anytime, and they will do it quite soon. And they definitely do not want to make changes to it, because it's a great politicum, I would just say. So if you are a company which is outside of the CSRD scope, or you're advising such companies, you can't make a mistake by simply starting with the VSME. I mean, the stuff which is in there is not bad in that sense. It just tells you, okay, these are the most important quantitative metrics. These are some kind of a broader context you can think of, but that's really it. And then on top of that, however, I would advise you to help companies to understand what their material impacts or at least areas of impacts might be in their operations and in the value chain, and put it out in the report, because that can really help to facilitate the communication with business partners, even though it's not covered by the VSME.
Okay, thank you so much. I would also like to bring Erika and Felicia in this discussion, because there's one question coming in related to both of your contributions. And perhaps, Erika, you can start first, and then Felicia, you can come in. The question is, how can Sustainapath from Amfori and Green Button help companies and brands meet the requirement of CSDDD, CSRD, and ESRS and the LKSG? Perhaps you can just give a very concise and short answer, because we are coming nearly to an end. Thank you.
Sure. So in terms of Sustainapath, I think the main support that we provide is helping through the due diligence process. So in the identification of what is material, what is not material, but then guiding the company in assessing those risks with, let's say, the right approach, or the impact with the right approach, and putting that and documenting it in the way where you can create your narrative with the outcome. So I think the main purpose of Sustainapath in this case is really guiding through the due diligence steps, helping in really focusing on the right areas, and then helping in, as I said, creating the narrative around the reporting. So documenting, recording, and then reporting on it.
Yeah, thanks so much.
That was short.
This was very
short
short, yes. Thanks. Felicia, would you also like to come in and explain this question on the green button?
Sure. The answer is quite similar to what Erika just said. So Green Button as well offers a variety of tools and services that help you install or manage your HREDD system, including this risk analysis tool, which is just an Excel tool that you can use, and you can adapt to your own needs. So you can add more columns or delete stuff as you like. And as such, it's a handy way to document the process, which helps you then when you're reporting it. But it's also meant to help you actually use it. So you use it, you devise your measures according to the risks that you find with your risk assessment, and then you track if those measures have been successful in addressing the risk, or you revise them if they weren't. And all of that is certified by Green Button auditors. However, the ultimate responsibility for adherence to the laws remains always with you as a company. even if you're certified to Green Button.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we are unfortunately nearing the end of today's session, and I know that there remain, some unanswered questions. So I wanted to offer you that when they are still burning and you would like to receive an answer, you can always reach out to us, and then we will get back to you in writing. And of course, this also applies to any questions that would come to your mind after the webinar. So with just 1 minute left, I would like to conclude today's session. Thank you all very much for attending today's webinar and for your actively engagement in the Q&A session. I think this great number of questions, also the high participant rate, definitely underscores the interest in this highly relevant topic. We have definitely covered a lot today, a lot to digest for you today, and I hope that you found today's session informative, but that this was also beneficial for you and that you now have gained a better understanding on of the interplay on the CSDDD with the CSRD, and then how companies can best integrate processes for an effective implementation. A big thanks goes, of course, to our esteemed speakers, to Misha, to Erika, to Felicia, and also to Philip. Your expertise and insights have been of great value for us today, and I personally am very grateful that you took the time today to share your topics with us. And last but not least, special appreciation as always to you, Valentina, and to your entire amfori team for ensuring such a smooth operation of this webinar. You can see on this slide now the QR code to scan for your feedback. And as mentioned at the beginning, your input will help us then to tailor future webinars to better meet your needs. And we from PSD and also from amfori, we're always eager to learn and to improve ourselves. So please participate in this satisfaction survey. On the next slide, you will receive the very last information from my end, and this is an advertisement on the next webinar. Most of you know that this is a webinar series, on due diligence laws and practice, and we already have a next webinar around the corner. So we invite you on June 5th. There will be the webinar on how CSDDD aligns with international due diligence standards. And you can already check out the amfori website and register if interested. Having said that, I conclude today's session. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and we are looking very much forward to seeing you soon. Goodbye.